Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. I'm going to show you another game with the Kalashnikov Sicilian, and in this game black wins by basically purely strategic means, which I think is very typical of the Sicilian, using a very healthy pawn structure. So I'm publicising my new book, there we go, King's Kalashnikov Sicilian, published by New in Chess in collaboration with Chessable. Of course, there's an online course on Chessable. I have to say, it's a really handsome volume. I think the designers at New in Chess have done a brilliant job. First of all, it's hardback. There we go, you can hear that. And the layout is very appealing. It's very generously spaced. Hopefully you can see that. And I think that's appropriate for basically the style that I've written the book. You know, the emphasis is on explanation and description rather than kind of reams of, you know, long variations. Many people simply prefer a book form because you can get an overview of the opening more easily than the online course, but you know, it just depends what you're used to, really. I should say that I've simplified some sections compared to the online course, but basically it is based on that online course, which I'm still very happy with. I've added a few more model games, for example, but basically it's the same course. So in previous videos I've looked at some really nice attacking games, but here I'd like to look at a model strategic game. I haven't included this in the book actually, this is extra. Because the pawn structure in the Kalashnikov is more or less fixed, then it's easier to understand strategy, and themes recur quite often. And this game is played by an absolute maestro, namely Almasi-Ivanchuk, playing the black side of the Kalashnikov. So without further ado, let's take a look. So it's an open Sicilian, and there we go, e5 and d6. So you can see we have pretty much fixed pawn structure at this point. And this is one of the main lines of the Kalashnikov. And now bishop e7, this is the move that I recommend in the book. Black is preparing knight f6, so you play bishop e7 before knight f6, you don't want to get pinned. And now white takes the opportunity to bring the knight into the centre. And knight f6 and g3. Now here in the book I recommend two moves. You can choose whichever one suits your style better. There's h5, which is great fun, advancing, good old Harry. Or you can play castles, which is what Ivanchuk did here. So this is more strategic. So bishop g2, and now black pushes the b pawn. Knight d5, knights are exchanged, and bishop g5. In the book I call this the breakout bishop. So this bishop wasn't doing much on e7, but once it gets to g5 it exchanges itself off for that bishop on c1, and that gives black a little bit more control over the dart squares. So I should say that Ivanchuk's opponent here is Almasi from Hungary, strong grandmaster. And this was a rapid play game, a blindfold rapid game no less. It's very impressive. Rook b8, and yeah, in the book I examine queen d3, the move played here. The sharpest move is f4, but actually this often harms white's king position. Black is actually okay there. Check the book if you want to take a look. Queen d3 played, so this is a quieter move. a5, and Ivanchuk is basically using these pawns as a kind of minority attack, and this is really significant. More on that in a second. So c3, at some point white has to play this move to stop the knight coming into d4. Now here Ivanchuk plays bishop e6. Actually, in the book, I recommend queen d8, and only then bishop e6. But bishop e6 immediately is also very playable. The reason I didn't recommend bishop e6 immediately is that I wanted to rule out this knight incursion. Actually, this is still completely playable for black. In some ways, it's quite similar to the game. Anyway, bishop e6 played by Ivanchuk. And Almasi decides to go in with the queen, and this does look a bit tricky. Hits the knight, and of course that knight defends the pawn here. In fact, black is absolutely fine. Rook c8. The rook comes across. You can see that black is very well coordinated here. And the rook on c8 not only defends the knight, but prevents knight c7 as well. Rook c1. Yep, there's potentially some action on the c file, so the rook comes over. Queen d8. The queen actually wasn't doing too much here, so it just comes back and protects lots of important squares, protects this pawn here, for example. And now, actually, black is a kind of threat. So let's suppose that white plays a normal move here, rook d1. This didn't happen. Black would exchange, and now take on d5. And if pawn takes, then black has a very healthy pawn structure. You know, this is a weak backward pawn, and this bishop doesn't look too good. And if rook takes instead, then knight b4, exploiting the pin and forking queen and rook. That's very nice. So that's the strategic threat after queen d8. So that's why Almasi brought the queen back to d3. And I should say, again, if the queen comes back to e2, then black would go in for this. And this is a beautiful pawn structure. So these pawns really healthy on the king side. And there are weak pawns here. Particularly, obviously, that pawn on c3. And black can use that c5 square, put the rook here, double on the c file, and there is pressure. So that's why queen d3 was played. And now we're going to see this minority attack in action. So pawn takes pawn on c3, and although white can recapture this pawn in 1, 2, 3, 4 different ways, actually none of them completely satisfactory. So if knight takes, then rook takes b2, that's very nice. And if rook takes, well, actually rook takes, rook fc1, white gets a bit of play there, that's annoying. But after rook takes, much better is to play bishop takes knight. Let's get rid of that powerful knight and play knight d4. And again, this is a very typical theme in the Kalashnikov, that black plants that beautiful knight on d4, can't be budged by a piece or by a pawn, and that is a really nice position for black. Strategically, black doing extremely well. Very typical. So Almasi, after pawn takes, decides to recapture with the pawn, but you can see that, well, this minority attack has actually borne fruit already, because now there are 2 isolated pawns here. It's possible just to play the knight back to e7 here. This is, I think, a very sound way of playing, because after knight takes, queen takes, that bishop is a beautiful piece. I mean, much better than the bishop on g2. Looking down at the pawn on a2, and these rooks very well placed. But Ivanchuk goes for rook b2, also a very strong move. Attacking the pawn on a2, a4. And now Ivanchuk again keeps it very simple and just exchanges off the knight on d5. Knight b8 is a very interesting move, with the idea knight d7 to c5. That's a beautiful square on c5, with pressure on these pawns. Not to mention hitting the queen, a little bonus. But the way Ivanchuk plays, strategically very simple, very clear. I guess in a rapid play game, particularly a blindfold game, that's no bad thing. So now that this bishop, the knight has been eliminated by the bishop, then the queen comes into play, and there is some pressure here. If queen takes, then the rook just comes in, and rook d2, and that's going to be curtains. So rook d1 played, rook d8, rook d2. Almasi just wanted to make sure that he gets rid of that pressure, or meets the pressure on the second rank. But black obviously doing very well here. All black's pieces very nicely placed. These major pieces, the d6 pawn is well protected. A lot of people kind of, I know some people have said to me, oh, I'm not sure about the Kalashnikov because of that backward d pawn. But actually, it's black's structure, which is so solid, so sound. And that d6 pawn is part of that structure. It can be protected very easily, and it often comes good in that game, this beautiful pawn structure. Whereas compared with white, not so good, not so healthy. Queen c2, g6, that's an important move, just to kind of stitch in time. You know, at some moment the king is going to need a square, an escape square on g7, and that's the way to do it. Just g6, it's a nice move. And now rook a3, a bit more pressure here. Bishop f1, so that bishop would like to anchor itself on b5, but queen c5, now that is a problem here. Queen b2, and well, here it's simply possible to take this pawn, but Ivanchuk goes for, instead of rook takes c3, he goes for rook takes a4. And Almasi is scrambling to exchange pieces here. Actually, it's an interesting position because here Almasi goes for a kind of wholesale exchange of pieces. He could play rook a2, and actually the rook is a bit stuck on e4. That might have been a better way for white to play. It's very unusual. It's not really possible to trap the rook, but the rook is a bit stuck. It's a funny position. But Almasi plays the normal move. He takes on d6. And check. And rook c1. c4, and the rook reaches the 7th rank, or the 2nd rank. Rook a6 and e4. So this is so typical of many Sicilian positions, and particularly with the Kalashnikov, that black manages to use this very healthy 4 against 3 kingside majority. So e3 threatened, the king comes back, knight f5, now the knight activates, rook takes, and knight d4. So although material is even, actually black is attacking really nicely, using the pawn majority, using that nice pawn on e4, and using the active knight and rook as well. The rook comes back. I mean, you know, suddenly, you know, this is very dangerous indeed. Knight here, and well, potentially you want to sacrifice pawn with e3 and then knight f3 check. It's extremely dangerous. So the rook comes back. King g7, softly, that's very nice. h3, knight f3 check, and knight e5. So that's spinning around to not that one, spinning around to d3. And there's also the threat of e3 as well, which white parries with rook e1. And now f5. So this is such a beautiful pawn structure. And we see this time and again. And this is now a threat. So if white passes, then knight d3, rook f1, e3, and black rolls forward. In the book, I call this the steamroller. You so often see the e and f pawns rolling down the board in the Kalashnikov. Almasi gives up the c pawn in order to bring the bishop back into play. So the bishop now covers d3. So that gets taken. And now, well, it's actually quite a well-known endgame position with 4 pawns against 3 on the king side. If it's just a rook endgame, then white has decent drawing chances. But with rook and knight against rook and bishop, black has excellent winning chances. And in fact, black is already rolling forward very quickly here. There we go. The steamroller, the F and E pawns. F4, rolling on, and I think black's position is already lost here. The rook checks, the rook activates, and rook c6. And again, this is very well known that, in fact, in this position, knight and 4 against bishop and 3 offers excellent winning chances for black. I mean, I would say it's probably just winning, even from a theoretical point of view. It's very hard for white to defend this, if not impossible. And in fact, Almasi decides, okay, I'm just going to try to exchange as many pawns as possible, and gives up the piece. But this is now lost, and Ivanchuk cleans up very easily, particularly with these isolated pawns. Let's just see how he does it. And the knight comes over, and knight d5, and that pawn is lost. But yeah, they're lost anyway. It's a lost position. So yeah, I want to emphasize that one can play the Kalashnikov really strategically, and right from the start. Let's just come back to this position. This minority attack is very important, and Ivanchuk used that. Sorry, queen d3 takes here. Ivanchuk used that to isolate those pawns, and eventually managed to win both of them. And black's pawn structure is really healthy. If we go right through to the end, that's what you're aiming for, to actually get in or realize this beautiful kingside pawn majority, and this is actually a lost position for white. So there we go. I hope you'll consider buying, perhaps looking at the online course on Chessable, and if you prefer the book version, then there you go. King's Kalashnikov Sicilian, available from newinchess.com.